The early part of the 20th century was very difficult for anybody who was trying to control or to govern the country of Russia. The economy was trying to get established in a very different way, and a way that wasn't very well organized. There were various political parties who were, to be sure, they were in their nascent form, but they were trying to get formulated, and each one with its own program for running the country. There were those who were very much attached to the old traditions of Russia. There were those who thought that the old traditions of Russia were nothing but exploitation. It was a time of ideological chaos in many different ways. And then, very foolishly, the Tsar sent the Russian fleet around the western part of Europe and down over the bottom of Africa and India to attack the Japanese. The Japanese were waiting for them and sent almost the whole Russian fleet to the very bottom of the ocean. It was a terrible naval defeat, followed by struggle on land, which led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers in the so-called Russo-Japanese War. This was the first time, mind you, for many, many centuries, that people from Asia had engaged in large-scale conflict with people from Europe, and it went rather badly for the Europeans. This, of course, was harbingers of things that might well be in the future, things that we should be thinking about at the moment. But in any case, the humiliation of the defeat at the hands of the Japanese was very difficult for the Tsarist regime to take. The result was an uprising, which for a short time revolutionary parties took over both the cities of Petersburg and Moscow, so that the Tsar was forced to issue a kind of manifesto that made it possible for the various parties of Russia to take part in a Duma, or parliament. And all through the first decade of the 20th century, after the war with Japan and up to World War I, there were struggles within that Duma trying to get some kind of power in their hand, trying to take some kind of power away from the Tsar. The Tsar, of course, tried very hard to keep power in his hands. And then, perhaps even more foolishly, in 1914, Nicholas II allowed himself to be drawn into a general European war, which we now call World War I, where Russia, a country, of course, of enormous size and enormous population, but only a very nascent industry, had to get into a conflict with very well-developed industrial systems of the Kaiser's Germany and another Kaiser's Austria-Hungary. And of course, the result were staggering numbers of deaths among the Russian troops. Millions and millions of Russian soldiers were killed in that war, and things seemed to go from bad to worse. George Kennan, has asked a very interesting rhetorical question about the outcome of that war. He said, if World War I had not taken place, and if the two Kaisers were on the throne in Berlin and in Vienna, and if the Russian Tsar was still on the throne, for all the bad things that happened under them, could that have been half so bad as the result which brought us Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini? The question, of course, is obviously rhetorical, and the answer is perfectly obvious. For Russia, it was a total disaster. By the year 1917, the Russian army was in desperate shape. The Russian home front was disintegrating, and the Tsar found himself far from, by that time Petersburg had been, the name of the city had been changed to Petrograd, because of course Petersburg is a German-type name, and they wanted it to be a Russian-type name. The Tsar found himself far from Petrograd, and terrible disorders were taking place in the city. He got telegrams from the city telling him what was happening. He decided to come back, and his train was stopped at the city of Pskov, which is somewhat to the west and slightly to the south of Petrograd, and representatives of the democratic parties forced him to abdicate his throne at that time. In February-March of 1917, the democratic parties forced the Russian Tsar to leave his throne and to give power to them in the Duma. The people in the Duma tried to cope with power. Of course, it was one thing to protest against what the Tsar had done, to carry on quasi-revolutionary activity. It was quite another thing to try to govern a huge country like Russia with its varied population, with its enormous and disintegrating economy, and worst of all, in a war with advanced industrial countries like Germany and Austria-Hungary. The task proved to be an increasingly difficult task for them. They carried their task out manfully. They tried very hard to solve some of the problems by parliamentary means, but it became very, very difficult for them. Finally, in October-November of 1917, they tried to call a constituent assembly together to work out a constitution for a new democratic Russia, a country which would be in some ways run like France or England or even to a certain extent the United States. And Lenin and his Bolsheviks realized that if they were going to carry out a real revolution, which they wanted, now was the time to do it. They struck in October, November of 1917. Their coup d'etat was successful. The provisional democratic government had to leave. The Constituent Assembly, which was trying to work out a constitution, was dispersed. And Lenin and his Bolsheviks found themselves in control of the entire country. Mind you, they still had to carry on the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. They didn't want to carry on the war. They wanted to have a peace, but of course Germany refused to simply stop the war. Eventually they were forced to negotiate the so-called Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where in return for their ceding large parts of what had been the western part of the Russian Empire, Germany agreed to a peace treaty with them, and the Bolsheviks were left to establish what they called their socialist government at that time. What they tried to bring about was something that later on was called war communism. They tried to bring about a total nationalization of industry, their total program all at once in just a very few years. And of course the result was to take an economy which was already falling apart and throw it into total disorder. After a few years into war communism, they realized that this simply was not going to work. Furthermore, they had to fight a tremendous civil war. They established an army called the Red Army. It was Trotsky who established this army to defend the socialist regime. Another army came up, governed mostly by former Russian officers in the Tsar's army, the so-called White Army, trying to overthrow the new socialist government. And this again killed tens and hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps even millions of people, in the Civil War, which dragged on for something like 2 or 3 years. There's nothing so bloody as fratricidal conflict, and of course Russia experienced this to a very great extent. Finally, the Red Army proved to be victorious. It turned out that Lenin and the Bolsheviks would continue to control the country, and then they had to face another war, an invasion from the west, from Poland, to a certain extent backed by Britain and France, invaded this new socialist country. The name USSR was not used until 1923, and of course this war took place in 1922, so it was simply the socialist regime at that point. The Polish army almost got to Moscow. The Red Army rallied itself and got almost to Warsaw. Once again, the Polish army started pulling it back. This time they decided to sign a treaty of peace, and the new line was established between Poland and the Socialist Republic, the so-called Curzon Line, where those people who were Roman Catholic, and Poles and Lithuanians were on the Polish side. Those people who were mostly Eastern Orthodox, the White Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Russians, were on the socialist side. And that Curzon Line became the boundary between what was to become the Soviet Union in 1923 and Poland, which that boundary lasted until World War II, when of course it was changed. The Bolsheviks found themselves in control of a country which was in a total mess, the economy was not working, people were starving, people were freezing to death in the Russian winter, there wasn't enough fuel, there wasn't enough of anything, and they realized that something had to be done. Now, Gorky was involved, of course, in all of this. He had hoped and dreamed. He was destined to play a prominent, important role in this process, although its actual twists and turns surprised him as much as they surprised the world looking on. He had dreamed about establishing this government. He had dreamed about being in what he thought would be a democratic Russia under a socialist regime. And of course, what he saw was a tremendous amount of violence and killing connected with the establishment of the whole country. And he wrote a famous series of newspaper attacks on what he and many other writers and intellectuals considered to be the totalitarian actions taken by Lenin and his followers. This was a newspaper called New Life, in Russian Novaya Жизнь. These articles were very, very bitter. He called them anachronistic thoughts, несвоевременные мысли. Anachronistic thoughts because they were thoughts that should have been anachronistic at that point, but what he saw around him was violence and the bringing down of culture, the killing of people in ways that he couldn't accept. Surprisingly, Lenin tolerated this for a number of months, perhaps for 8 or 9 months, possibly because of the personal relationship he had with Gorky, no doubt because Gorky had given a tremendous amount of support to the revolutionaries before the revolution, and Lenin felt that he owed him something. But eventually, Lenin, of course, even with Gorky, Lenin couldn't stand it. He closed the newspaper down. Gorky found himself in a very difficult position, so he threw himself into another project, a project which he called Mirovaya Literatura, which means world literature. The idea was that he would get battalions of Russian writers, battalions of good writers in Russian who would know foreign languages, and they would translate the very best of world literature into high-quality translations in the Russian language. The best of world literature would be represented in very, very good Russian translations, which would then be published in rather cheap editions that the whole population could get access to. So that this population, which previously had been illiterate, would be made literate and would be brought up. The cultural level of the entire country would be brought up to that high level, which once upon a time had been simply the possession of the aristocrats of the previously literate part of the population, a tiny, tiny proportion of the population. In short, what he wanted to do was to engage in mass education. By the way, a very American idea, an idea they took from the United States of America, which had done this at the end of the 19th century. A mass education which would give you a totally literate and a highly cultured population. It was, of course, a dream which unfortunately couldn't come true in the conditions of Russia at that time. But it was a great dream, and as a matter of fact, it did produce some very, very high-quality translations. At the same time, Gorky also repeatedly exploited his close relationship to Lenin on behalf of writers and intellectuals who found themselves in trouble with the repressive and often violent new government. He worked to get them decent food rations at a time of widespread starvation. He got them fuel to get them through the Russian winter. He saved no small number of them from the Bolshevik firing squads. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that the continuation of Russian culture at that time, to a very great extent, was due to the efforts of Gorky and those who supported Gorky in those efforts at the time. He deserves a great deal of credit for what he did at that point. The breaking point came in 1922, when a very fine poet by the name of Gumilyov was arrested and threatened with execution. Because although Gumilyov himself had done nothing against the regime, he had been involved with certain people who had been involved in counter-revolutionary activities. When they asked him to name the names of his friends, he absolutely refused to do that. He was a brave man, and he was going to protect his friends. The family, of course, came immediately to Gorky because they knew that Gorky had saved other people from the firing squads. Gorky agreed to do it. He went to Lenin, asking him to rescind the proposed execution of Gumilyov. Lenin was not very happy about it, but nevertheless, grumbling to a certain degree, he agreed to do it. He composed a telegram which was to be sent to rescind the execution. Gorky went back and told the family it was all right. He would not be executed. You can imagine the reaction of the family. And then, either accidentally or on purpose, that telegram from Lenin was lost, and in spite of the promise, Gumilyov was executed. Gorky saw this as the final straw. He felt that he was compromised in the eyes of the people around him. In fury, he said he was going to leave the country. Lenin said, yes, that's fine. You go ahead and leave. As a matter of fact, you're a sick man. Gorky had suffered from tuberculosis. You go abroad, you get treatment from good doctors. He said, don't let Russian doctors touch you. And it's rather interesting that Lenin himself said, and particularly don't let a Bolshevik doctor deal with you. You go to Germany, you go to Switzerland, you get medical help. And so Gorky, by this time in a great fury, left the country and wrote a pamphlet which would have ripped the hide off a hog, called About the Russian Peasantry, where he described the cruelties that had taken place in the country between the Red Army and the White Army. He said, I don't care whether it's the Red Army or the White Army, they're all Russians, and Russians are only capable of doing cruel things. Russians could do nothing creative in their own country. Rather curious statement for the man who had such admiration for the Russian culture of the 19th century. But the article which he wrote obviously was deeply sincere and expressed deep passions of anger which he felt against the country. Well, once he got to Berlin, he tried to publish some Russian books in a new publishing house in Berlin, which could then be imported to the Soviet Union and help people there. But of course, these books never reached the Soviet Union. That didn't work. So he left Berlin. He went to first of all to Prague and then to Sorrento, a city in the south of Italy, where he continued writing and trying to influence the course of the literary events in the USSR. And by the way, while he was in Italy, he wrote one of his better novels, a novel about the so-called Artamonovs, family which was subject to decadence in the last days before the revolution.